Let's get started with our Bible study. As we continue to journey through the songs of the ascents, we come tonight to Psalm 131, which Spurgeon once said was one of the shortest psalms to read and one of the longest psalms to learn. That's right. I have help tonight, which we may turn to if you all aren't responsive enough. I'll just hand you over and see what happens. It could work, right? Right, Lily? I know. So we're going to begin tonight, as we have, by reading the psalm first time. Just listen. So just give yourself a moment to kind of quiet, center yourself. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have calmed and quieted myself. I'm like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. Okay, yeah. I told you I have help. Emily, do not make her mad. Oh. All right, I'm going to read it again. This time, I want you to listen for a word you need to hear tonight. Sometimes I ask you to listen for a word that just pops out, but maybe, what's a word in here that, as you sit here tonight, I think I need that word. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have calmed and quieted myself. I'm like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. Take a minute, talk to the folks with your table, or Mike, you can talk to yourself, about what word is there that maybe feel like maybe that's a word for you tonight. That's a word you needed to hear. Take a minute, talk about that. So, if you're willing to share, maybe not, maybe that's a little personal, but if you're willing to share it, what word did you kind of hear? You think, I think that word is for me tonight.
All of us said content.
Content.
Calm and quieted. For us. We're the phrase.
Yes, for us.
Calm and quiet and content. There's an argument at the table where they want to be content, calm and quiet.
One leads to the other.
Okay.
Barb wants to
Anybody else? Calm and quiet. Wait. Okay. Bruce?
Proud, but it was in
Proud, but in the negative, okay? All right? Anybody else? Okay, I'll read it one more time. And Peterson says this psalm is about humility. So listen for echoes of humility here. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have calmed and quieted myself. I'm like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. Again, take just a minute or two, round your tables. Echoes of humility that you hear in that song.
Not counting on yourself, just do everything.
So this is how Peterson renders the psalm. God, I'm not trying to rule the roost. I don't want to be king of the mountain. I haven't meddled where I have no business or fantasized grandiose plans. I kept my feet on the ground. I've cultivated a quiet heart. Like a baby content in its mother's arms, my soul is a baby content. Wait, Israel, for God. Wait with hope. Hope now, hope always. What echoes of humility did you pick up? Either in the NIV reading or maybe in what Peterson said there. And some of you I know are reading along here in the book, so you've probably read that already. But what echoes of humility do you get?
I think when they're talking about hope in the Lord,
Hope in the Lord.
it tells you that I'm not smart enough to handle this.
Okay, I can't handle it, so I need to put my hope in the Lord. Yep. Okay. What else? Seems like the opening verse and a half is on the nose, right? I'm not trying to rule the roost, he says. NIV says that my heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters. What's the word humility mean to you? What's humility? You're all too humble to offer your opinion.
Not being full of yourself.
Not being full of yourself, okay? Isn't it interesting that we often define humility by its negative? We're not proud. The psalmist does it. I'm not proud. I'm not proud. My eyes are not haughty. I don't do these things that are none of my business. I don't want to rule the roost. I'm not full of myself. We see humility as the absence of pride. Sometimes I think we see humility in the other things that synonyms we might use are meek, mild, almost to the point of meaning passive. Somebody's humble, maybe we see them as weak in some way. And so we struggle a little bit with this idea of humility. And we know we're not supposed to be proud. Although, I don't know about for you, but in my family and in the culture in which I grew up down in Western Kentucky, to be proud of something was a compliment. It wasn't an expression of the vice of pride or hubris. It was, I'm proud of that. It was like, I'm grateful for that. I think my dad said that all the time. It's like, well, I'm proud of that. You know, I'm proud for you. Have you ever heard that phrase? So, we're not talking about that kind of pride. We kind of see humility as the opposite of that. Maybe it helps. What does humility look like? If you had to offer an image of humility, what image would you offer?
An accurate assessment.
An accurate assessment. An accurate assessment of yourself.
Or something else.
Or something else, okay?
Doing a chore that my wife didn't ask me to do, and I did it.
Doing a chore that your wife didn't ask you to do? Is that an exceptional occurrence? Or is that happening all the time?
No.
Well, at least you're humble about it.
Yeah.
I think we do often go to servant image, a servant imagery. You know, an image of humility is image of a servant. And that makes sense. And that's what we think of, for instance, when we think of the humility of Jesus. We think of the great Christ hymn of Philippians 2. Jesus, though he was God, did not cling to his rights as God, but took on the form of a servant, became obedient, there's that word again, unto death. That's what we think of when we think of humility. It's interesting here that Peterson says that we might consider humility as a tool. Instead of a result, it's a tool. He calls Psalm 131 a maintenance psalm. I think it's really an interesting way to think about it. And he equates humility with pruning. Now, some of you know about pruning. I know Jeannie knows about pruning. You know, some people know a lot about pruning. I don't know a lot about pruning. I grew up on a farm with no orchards. We didn't prune nothing. We either, it either grew or we cut it down. Those were the two options. And so when we got to our house in Rome specifically, we had azaleas and crepe myrtles and all these things in the yard that have to be pruned. So my version of pruning those things was to take out the electric hedge clippers and just whack them off. Just cut them as far back as I could cut them, and I thought they would live. And that's what I thought pruning was. Until I was working at the church one day, and we had a courtyard there that was enclosed. It had a lot of just beautiful plants in it. And I was working there with a lady named Ann Milam, who years ago passed away. And I started doing what I was doing because we were down there pruning. She said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "You said you want to prune the plants. This is what we do." And she said, "Put that down. Put it down and step back." She said, "Let me show you what to do." And she had, the hand lopper, bypass cutters and all those things. She said, "Look, here's what we're going to do." And she started to show me how to prune these bushes. And she said, "I'm going to tell you that when we're done, you're going to think that's ugly and that I've killed this plant. That's what you're going to think." She said, "But when we come back in the spring, you're going to see how beautiful it is." And she told me how important it was to go in and you get the dead wood and you create space where there's air in there. You all know these things. I didn't know any of that stuff. And I learned what that was. And Peterson says that this psalm is about that kind of pruning that creates space in our lives where what's growing can be more connected to the roots, more connected to the soil, where you can get air and sunlight and all those in those places that otherwise we just kind of let grow over. And I think that's an interesting way to think about pride. That we just think that we're just growing beautifully and everything is necessary and important and you don't ever have to touch anything because we're perfect. Most of you probably remember that old Mac Davis song, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I just can't wait to look in the mirror because I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. I must be one heck of a man. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect like I am." I'm not going to tell you why I know all the words of that song. But I think that's the essence of pride, which says, I am perfect like I am, and I am in control of my life. Peterson says the only way to get at that and to shape us up again and to do the maintenance that we need to do on us is with humility. Now, he goes on to say that what that does is works on these pairs of things in our lives. For instance, this pairing of ambition and aspiration. And he says those two things are kind of a little bit of opposites in our lives. And it's a challenge for us, I think, especially in our culture sometimes, to think about ambition being a problem. Because we normally see ambition as being motivated. You know, if we're looking to hire somebody, we want to hire somebody with ambition, right? We want somebody who has... But he's not talking about that sense of motivation. He's talking about a different kind of ambition. He's talking about aspiration, which is hope, which is what we hope to become, without dependence upon God. So ambition is aspiration without trust in God. It's, I want to be this, and I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to make this a reality in my life. I'm going to take over this part of what I'm doing. And it's not that God's doing it in me, but I'm doing it for myself. And so at one point he says here, our lives are lived well only when they are lived in the terms of their creation, with God loving and us being loved, with God making and us being made, with God revealing and us understanding, with God commanding and us responding. Being a Christian means accepting the terms of creation, accepting God as our maker and redeemer, and growing day by day into an increasingly glorious creature in Christ, developing joy, experiencing love, maturing in peace. By the grace of Christ, we experience the marvel of being made in the image of God. As he goes on, he makes, I think, a really crucial point. And Mike, you hit on it when you said an accurate assessment. An accurate assessment of what we are. The tool of humility is not meant to just cut us all the way back. Because when you cut something all the way back, you actually make it vulnerable. You make it vulnerable to disease, you make it vulnerable to frost or freeze, you make it vulnerable to insects when you cut it all the way back. And Peterson's, I think, right to say sometimes with this idea of using humility to correct the wrong concept that we're perfect and we don't need to be pruned and we don't need anything. If we go too far, we can actually damage the image of God that's in us. And so it's about finding this sense of balance. It's not about just saying I'm worthless and I'm terrible and I'm awful. It's about understanding, no, I am made in the image of God, but I'm kind of overgrown here. I'm kind of out of hand over here. this part of my life is dead, it's a branch that's not producing fruit, those kind of things. Humility shapes all that up, prunes all that up, but it doesn't take away who we are in God, remembering that we are made in the image of God. We are God's beloved creation. It just helps us to find the balance of that. It helps us to get back to aspiration, which is hoping in what God is doing in our lives. Israel, wait, hope in God. Put your hope in God. Put it there. He says the other thing that humility helps us with is the balance between love and desperation. That's an interesting concept. And he uses here, he talks about the image that the psalmist uses to demonstrate humility, which is a child in its mother's arms. How do you think that image represents humility? What about that image to you represents humility?
A child is dependent on the mother
Child is dependent on the mother. Yep.
and knows it can't do anything.
Can't do anything for itself at that stage, right?
It's that being content because you know God is like a mother.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to take care of you when
Right?
how you need it.
And we can't do anything on our own.
We can't do anything our own, but what's the contentment rooted in?
Trust.
Trust.
Yeah.
And trust, in so many ways, is built on experience. The child's content in the mother's arms because the mother has fed that child before. They can trust that because it's happened. There's a consistent experience with it. What do you think? Why do you think the psalmist talks about a weaned child? Why do you think it's important that the child is weaned?
They're a little bit independent
Okay.
at that stage. But they still choose reliance on the mother because they know the trust is there. Because they know.
I think you're right. There's a move toward independence. It's one step further along. They could go eat a bug if they had to. There is that one step, but there's something there about their choosing at that moment. Our middle grandson is 2.5, and he is not cuddly at the moment. And some of you know what I mean by that. He is not in. He was big time cuddler when he was little. And he, at this moment, if you try to hold him, like, no, meet you down, let me go, I don't want, do not do that right now. And so from that experience, when I read that, I think, oh, this is a child choosing to be there. Content in that place. They don't have to be, because they don't have to be in their mother's arms to eat. I think that's the reason it's a weaned child. They don't have to be there to eat. They may still be dependent upon the provision of the mother and the provision of the household, but they don't have to be in that very spot to eat in that moment. There's something about that's happening there that's an active choice to trust. And so humility is in a sense saying, I am willing to trust in God. I'll be content because I'm willing to trust in God. And the Psalm says something about how we get there. What does it say in the Psalm about how you get to that place? It says, I'm not this, I am this, and in the middle it tells us how you get there.
I have quieted myself.
I have quieted myself. It's the second part of that
Well, it's right there in the middle. It's the second verse is what I meant to say. I have calmed and quieted myself. What does that mean? Peterson talks about, he uses the phrase, the plain way. The plain way of quiet Christian humility. What does that mean to you? The plain way. How do you interpret that? What's the opposite of the plain way?
Hard way?
The hard way?
I don't know.
That's kind of like, when people say we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way, right? Yeah, okay. I think about plain as simple. He's saying we can quiet ourselves when we're willing to take the approach of simplicity.
Take the plain way versus the complex way. I am good at complicating simple things in my own mind. It's not hard to do. To take something that really is pretty direct and pretty simple and make it really complicated. Why do you think I do that without trying to get into my head and psychoanalyze me? Why do you think I do that? And maybe the real question is, why do you do that? Because you probably do the same thing.
You want to be in control.
Absolutely. Complexity gives us control, we think. Because the reality is, often the simple thing at the center of whatever we're doing, we cannot control. So what we try to do is complicate a whole bunch of stuff around it so we feel better about, hey, look at me, I'm getting this done, until you get down to the actual thing and I can't actually do anything about that. But we have this, it's an illusion of control that we create for ourselves. And humility helps us break the illusion, but only if we will calm and quiet ourselves. So how do we do that? This psalm I knew was shorter, and so I thought it might be a good opportunity for us to talk about some practices that help use this tool of humility. And there are 2 or 3 I just want to kind of throw out tonight. Some of these you may know about, some of these you may have never heard about at all. But just to think about applying some of these. For instance,
The practice of Sabbath. We know what Sabbath is, right? Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. We're supposed to rest, we're supposed to worship. That's Sabbath practice. Why does that help develop humility? Why does that use the tool of humility in our lives, the practice of Sabbath?
what's the connection?
Helps keep us close to God and
Okay?
keep a relationship with God.
Helps to keep us close to God and keep the relationship with God. It's time set aside for that, sure.
Sometimes takes control out of our
Say that one more time, Moses.
it sometimes takes control out of our hands.
Sometimes things can feel out of our hands,
Control.
out of control. So we kind of take a breath, as we teach people to do sometimes in that moment. Take a breath, okay? Why does God want us to practice Sabbath? Besides, I'm going to take this answer off the table, besides that we need rest physically, which we do, we know that. Why is the practice of Sabbath so important that it's in the top 10?
Probably because your mind races so fast with everything going on in the world today and in our lives. And
Right.
it's so fast we can't even think or focus, and we lose sight on the main focus.
Sure, it helps us to there's so much going on to take a step back and to recollect and to come to that place and focus. I think that's part of it.
God is first.
To simplify. What'd you say, Bruce?
God is first.
God is first.
In all manner.
In all things, in all manners. And what it says is, if we are willing to rest, in order to rest, you have to be able to trust. To be willing to fully engage in Sabbath rest means that we're trusting in God to provide it. It's not all up to me. That I don't have to work 7 days a week to get it done. That I can take the rest that God offers and allow then to trust in God's provision. It deepens our trust. And it makes us give up this feeling of self-reliance, of self-importance. How hard is it to sit down and be still? How hard is that? Because you always got something you got to do. There's always somebody who's depending on you, you think. There's always something else that has to be done right now. The practice of Sabbath breaks our dependence upon self. It shifts that dependence over to God. And I'll confess to you, I am lousy at it. Now, my friend Todd Nelson down the street, some of you were probably in one of his workshops when we did them 3 weeks ago. He did one on discipleship and kind of his own personal practices of discipleship and how he teaches that. And he is absolutely committed to keeping Sabbath in his life. He also fasts, which is something else I'm not crazy about. But anyway, But he told, and I will tell you, as we've talked about it, and I try to do it, but as we've talked about it, it has, I understand from the perspective of somebody, from a perspective of a fellow pastor, what that means. To be able to say, you know what, God can deal with this without me. I don't have to be there to represent God today. God can do this just fine without me. And I think that's hard for all of us to admit. But that's what that practice of Sabbath is for. And when I say that, when I say Sabbath, what I'm talking about is carving out intentional time where you are resting and recreating and not focused on producing and doing and making and all of those things for the sake of your own financial support or the care of somebody else or whatever, something that is restorative to your soul. Giving time to that and taking a step out of the craziness of life. And so sometimes it may be helpful if you don't have the ability to do that for a whole day, maybe start with a Sabbath morning every now and then, or a Sabbath evening, or something that you can set aside. You know what? I'm not going to do anything else. I'm just going to be quiet. I'm going to rest. I'm going to pray. I'm going to whatever. I'm going to take this time away. I'm going to intentionally unplug and just do this for this period of time. It starts to adjust our own sense of self-importance over time. Another practice that I found really helpful is one called centering prayer. Is that familiar? Anybody? Okay. So, centering prayer is really an ancient practice, but it was brought back into American spirituality by a guy named Thomas Merton. Merton was a monk over at Gethsemane, just outside of Louisville, and became pretty famous in the United States in the 60s and 70s by kind of reestablishing a connection to the broader kind of world of church, to some old practices, first century Christian practices, and getting back to the roots of what we would
kind of commonly call meditation, but not meditation in an Eastern sense, meditation from really a traditional Christian perspective. And the way Merton taught centering prayer is that you find a quiet place, you get comfortable, you get quiet, and you try to let the things, the concerns, the worries of the world kind of drift away. And in their place, you focus on a word or a phrase. So you take that word or phrase, and you just try to kind of hold it in your mind. And when something else comes up, it comes along, you start thinking about, oh, I forgot to get, corn or whatever. Then you go, well, no, wait a minute. I go back, and it pulls you back. And that's what's called centering. It's supposed to kind of help you to center and help you to focus. And what centering prayer is meant to do is help us to focus on the presence of God already with us all the time. The God who is there with us, around us all the time, that we don't notice and we don't see and we don't experience. Most people who teach centering prayer suggest that you won't do it for this long the first time, I promise. But the normal practice is 20 minutes at a time. To sit and to focus for 20 minutes. Now, if you want to learn more about that, experience that, our folks over at Good Shepherd do centering prayer retreats, easy for me to say, centering prayer retreats about 3 times a year. And they're usually an all day on Saturday, and they have multiple sessions through the day. And some of you have, through the years with exchanges, met Hendry Harrison, who's the dean over there. And I'm sure he would welcome your attendance. And he teaches that to his congregation, and they practice it together. What I found through the years in practicing that is that it helps you find again where God is. Because what happens to me is that as I'm going through my day or going through my week, I forget about it. I forget about where God is. And I know you think, wait a minute, you're supposed to be tracking all the time. Believe it or not, there are other things that aren't always, I'm not always sitting in my office studying the Bible. Not always. So the idea that all of us have to sometimes kind of come back to that place, come back to that understanding that God is indeed present with us. I thought about taking a shot at it tonight, but I don't think this is the environment. I don't think it'll be successful. There's just too much going on. But I would encourage you sometimes in the next couple of days, just give yourself a 5-minute shot at it. And I promise you that's going to feel like 3 hours the first time you do it. But just try it for 5 minutes. And you can use that word I asked you to listen for earlier. That word that you needed, that word that you wanted. You don't have to agree with, you can use your own word, Barbara. You don't have to take what Maureen told you it should be. You could use your own. And just try it for 5 minutes. Now, here's what we know based on a lot of research over a lot of years. A lot of people have done a lot of studies. People who practice contemplative prayer regularly have lower blood pressure, lower blood sugar. You know why? Because it slows down that worry cycle that we're in all the time. That fight or flight cycle that just runs in our lives all the time because we're constantly working against something or trying to get away from something or whatever. And when we're doing that, it's pumping adrenaline into our system, and it causes all those things to go up. And what centering prayer does is it lets the steam out of the kettle. And the deeper faith, the more trust and dependence we have on God, the less trust and dependence we place in ourselves, the quieter we are, the calmer we are. I think there's a reason that the word there in the Hebrew where he says, I've calmed myself, is a physical calmness. It's a stillness. You know, it's what the psalmist says, be still and know. Be still first. You got to be still so that we can know in that sense. So you can think about Sabbath, you can think about centering prayer. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about tonight comes from a different book, different author, but another kind of 20th century classic in my mind, and that's a fellow named Richard Foster and Celebration of Discipline. How many of you, maybe through the years, have studied Celebration, Foster? Okay. He talks about kind of 12 classic Christian disciplines. And we talk about spiritual practices, disciplines, same thing. And he divides them into inward, outward, and upward. It's kind of the way he talks about them. And when we're talking about humility, some of them are inward disciplines. You know, we've talked about prayer. We've talked about meditation in a way. But a second group of them he talks about are the outward disciplines. And here are the names of them: simplicity, solitude, submission, and service. I don't think they're intentionally 4 S's, but that's kind of how it works. What do you think the practice of simplicity might involve? By the way, Foster has separate books on several of these individual practices. A tremendous book on prayer. His book on simplicity is called The Freedom of Simplicity. What do you think the practice of simplicity might involve? It does not involve shopping. It does involve stuff at a certain level. It involves in kind of honing an intentional relationship to your stuff that's rooted in your trust in God's provision. Because so often we look for security in our stuff, in what we have. And we hold on to stuff because we think someday we might need it. Right? That's how we say it. We keep that because we might need it. Now, I'm all for recycling, reusing, all that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, but he's talking about here a healthier approach to what we own based in humility. The plain way. How much time, effort, and energy do you spend collecting, storing, moving, maintaining, cleaning your stuff? And so simplicity is saying, what has God provided me in trust that God has provided me what I need? Now, in reality, those first commandments about God is God and God is the only God, and you need to have your allegiance only to God, and the practice of Sabbath is a way of reminding yourself of that and trusting in God's provision for you. Those set up the second part of the commandments, which really are very concrete ways of saying, I trust in God to give me what I need, that what God has provided is what is right for me. So don't covet, because God's already given you what you need. You don't need what they have. God's given you what you need. Don't steal, because God gave that to them, not to you. God gave you what you need. Don't take up your neighbor's wife. Why? Because God already gave you one. That's the one you're supposed to have. Don't go get somebody else's. Do you trust in God's provision? Simplicity is rooted in learning how to trust in God's provision. And so being willing to learn to live with less. to learn to live with what God has given you. Solitude. What do you think that's about?
Do what? I mean, if you know the definition of the word, this one is not hard.
Get rid of the noise of the world.
Get rid of the noise of the world, which often comes in other people, right, Jim? Oh, you didn't need to point. I wouldn't have pointed right there, I don't think. Especially not here in front of everybody, witnesses and all. To be alone, and to be alone with God. Now, some people spend some of their life alone already. And being aware of God's presence in that place. But for others, it does require sometimes to get away. And maybe even in terms of the practice of solitude is even if you, for instance, live by yourself, to get out of your normal everyday context, to get out of your normal everyday routine and go off. When the New Testament talks about Jesus praying, what does it often say? What do the gospel writers often say? He went off to a quiet place. He went off by himself. He went up into the hills. He went somewhere else, to get away from these people who are following him all the time, sometimes to get away from the crowd. But actually, he was doing that to spend time with the Father. I think solitude in our day and time is really one of the more overlooked practices. And you can get some overlap here, right? You get how solitude and Sabbath and meditation and centering, all these things can kind of overlap. It's okay to do those things together because in some cases that's what they're created to do. But the practice of solitude really is an interesting practice. Sometimes that's a walk in the woods. Sometimes it's a walk alone in your neighborhood. Sometimes that's a retreat. Do you know that you can do individual spiritual retreats at 2 or 3 places within driving distance to us? Gethsemane Seminary over just outside of Louisville. You can do a private retreat there, just you. And you can do a silent retreat. And you go over there and the monks cook for you and take care of you and they won't talk to you, they'll leave you alone. And you have that time to do that. There are several places where you can do that locally. And if it's not something you've ever done, it's a really neat experience. I find that helpful when you can find the opportunity to do that. But solitude is part of that practice. And here again, what solitude does is it uses that tool of humility to break kind of our codependence on other people. That unhealthy sometimes connection we have with others, that we need that other person, or we need that other person to need us. That's the humility part, is we need that other person to need us. And sometimes solitude can kind of help break that.
You can just lose your phone.
You could just lose your phone. That has I would say that if you could really practice Sabbath, I think a key important part of that would be not with your phone. Not with your phone. This is a rabbit. We got just a minute to chase this one. In staff this week, we about, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a year, we'll all read the same book and then we'll spend some time kind of talking about the implications of it and kind of learning from each other and doing that, just ongoing professional development.
And we just finished a book called How We Grow Up. It's Mark Richtel is the guy who wrote it, New York Times guy. It's for the secular market, and he wrote it based on research around the changes in adolescence. And what researchers are finding is that adolescence is starting earlier and lasting longer. what used to be kind of a 12, 13 to 17 kind of thing is now more like a 9 to 10 to 22 to 23 kind of thing. And in all different aspects of that is fascinating research. And they've done a lot of it with MRI data and brain development, all that. It's kind of interesting stuff. And as comes up a lot these days in what is a crisis, a mental health crisis of anxiety among adolescents, is this idea of social media and phones and screen time and all that kind of stuff. And what he makes the point of at one time is yes, there's some detrimental, but he talks about social media being a volume knob. So if you feel good about yourself, you're probably going to feel better about yourself if you're on there with other people. If you feel bad about yourself, you're going to feel worse after you're on. That's kind of his basic theory. But he says the more important thing is what it keeps us from. And with teenagers especially, it's keeping them from a couple of really crucial things. Well, 3 to be specific. One is sleep. The average length of sleep for an adolescent in the U.S. in the last couple of years is down to like 6.5 hours a night. How many of you knew a teenager who only slept 6.5 hours a night? You know, and it's because of the fascination, with these devices and the time spent with them. It's not that they're bad, but they're keeping them from something good. They also talk about it keeps them from real interaction and real community with people. They think community's here, but it's not here. And so they don't have that interaction and community with others. And the other thing it says is it's keeping them inside. And so outside activity has diminished. And so their willingness to take risk has changed. I'm getting a little bit deeper in the weeds here than I meant to, but sometimes you get started in this way. 15 years ago, emergency room visits for adolescents were largely related to physical risk-taking. Broken bones, those kind of things. Drunk driving, alcohol consumption, drug consumption, all of that. Now the most dominant emergency room visits are for mental health reasons. Anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide attempt, all that. And it's because the risk-taking that they're doing is internal and not external. So it's that sense in which we have to understand, again, who we are, who we're made in the image of God, we're worthy and valuable of this, but it requires practice. It requires us doing something to put us in that place more and more and more and more. And that's kind of what I'm talking about tonight, those kind of practices. And that's one of the things we talked about as staff is, part of what we've got to start equipping our children with. When they get to be 9th and 10th grade, we might have waited a little too late. What we've got to start equipping our children with are these ways of understanding who they are in Christ and the connection that they have to the presence of God and to other people that are meaningful. That connection that exists with others who are not their parents. Because that's really critical. So anyway, that's extra. Won't charge you anything for that. The last two kind of go together. This idea of submission and service. Part of I think what we know about learning humility is that serving other people is a way of practicing humility. I think we know that already. That when we serve someone else, and primarily that's because when we serve another person, we are literally doing what Jesus did. We're taking on that form of Christ in us, and that is humbling in and of itself. Because we can't serve, we can't submit in that way to another person and their needs and their problems and whatever else it'll be without the work of Christ in us consistently over time. So, as Spurgeon said, short psalm doesn't take long to read, but it takes a whole lot longer to learn. So thanks for being here. Remember that next Wednesday night is Appalachian Shoebox Night. The next Wednesday night is our quarterly business meeting. So we'll be back the next Wednesday after that. So we have a couple of weeks. And try some of these things. And I'd love to hear how it goes and what your experience is. Let's pray together. God, you alone are God, and we are not. And some days we know that full well, and other days we are full of ourselves. And so, God, would you use the pruning tool of humility to shape us so that we are healthy and producing fruit? Because at the core of who we are is your image and your presence. So help us to connect to that. Help us to remember that you are with us, that we trust in you, that we are choosing to be content and to wait and to put our hope in you. So go with us now. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.